Good afternoon, and welcome to the Johns Hopkins Congressional Briefing Series. As America's first research university, Johns Hopkins is committed to sharing the knowledge of our faculty experts. Today, we'll focus on what to expect for the future of psychedelics. My name is Lainie Rutkow, and I'm Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Initiatives at Johns Hopkins University and a professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and the School of Advanced International Studies. I'll be moderating today's briefing. The use of psychedelics for medicinal and recreational purposes has been a hot topic in recent years. Namely, how do we balance the potential benefits and harms? Today, I'm joined by several of my colleagues from Johns Hopkins who are at the forefront of research about psychedelics and their potential impact. Fred Barrett is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Sandeep Nayak is an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and medical director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Matt Eisenberg is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and director of the Center for Mental Health and Addiction Policy. I want to remind our audience that we will be providing answers to your questions in real time. So please submit questions for our experts in the box that you see at the bottom of your screen. I'll now ask each of our panelists for their initial thoughts, and then we'll quickly move to Q&A. Fred, you are a pioneer in the field of psychedelic research. What should policymakers in the nation's capital know about your work and the promise that it holds for Americans?
Thank you very much for that question, Lainie, and thank you all for your interest and attention today. We have been conducting psychedelic research at Johns Hopkins University in what has now become the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research since the early 2000s. During this time, we've published a number of the most cutting edge and leading studies that are demonstrating not only the potential safety and potential efficacy of psychedelic therapies for the treatment of mood disorders, substance use disorders, and a growing number of indications. But we are also at the forefront of trying to understand the risks and the potential ways to mitigate those risks of psychedelic use, not only within the controlled settings of the laboratory and the clinic, but also out in the world for individuals who are using these substances outside of controlled settings. We want to understand these risks so that we can be as well positioned as possible to be an educational resource and a point of contact to help not only clinicians and scientists understand these things, but policymakers, lawmakers, other stakeholders, and the general public. We want you to understand that these are powerful agents. They may be powerful agents of change, and we want to do the best as possible to carefully and systematically assess these agents for the wide range of indications they may be useful for.
Fred, Sandeep, your work largely focuses on psychedelics used as treatment for addictions. Please tell us about some of your research and what we can expect from psychedelics as a form of treatment.
So I'm going to be leading trials of psilocybin for opioid use disorder as well as PTSD, but I've also worked on clinical trials of psilocybin for depression, other substance use disorders, OCD, anorexia. And just kind of wearing the psychiatrist hat, if I could sort of state what makes these so interesting and compelling, is that, well, one, when this treatment works, it tends to work quickly. We're talking about a treatment that is administered 1 to a handful of times, which has very few precedents when it comes to the kinds of conventional treatments that you see in psychiatry or psychology. And there are risks, of course, but many of the risks can be adequately managed with appropriately selected people in carefully controlled settings. And the fact that this class of drugs is being studied for so many different types of conditions, substance use disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, it is actually plausible. And part of that is because we tend to think, most people who work in this field, I would say, tend to think of this as a kind of drug-assisted psychotherapy. This intervention has powerful drug effects, but it also has powerful psychological effects. So we don't think of it as just a molecule that's having effects on people in a uniform way. It really is an interaction. And yet the jury is still out. There's still, these are not approved drugs. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done to adequately figure out who and how and if these can be used safely for a variety of conditions.
Thanks, Sandeep. Matt, are there parallels between psychedelics and cannabis in terms of policy considerations or even commercial viability?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lainie. I think there are some similarities, but there are also quite a bit of differences. Historically, both psychedelics and marijuana have faced really strict regulatory classifications for both possession and use. And over the past 10 or so years, or even 15 years, marijuana's path has influenced public perception and policy across the United States. So it might create a partial blueprint for psychedelics, though there are some really important differences. Marijuana has really broad medical and recreational applications. Psychedelics are primarily used for specific medical treatments like the ones that were just discussed under really controlled healthcare settings. This is not the case like a consumer-focused model, but one where administration requires trained professionals to be around and help the patients receive their therapy. When it comes to commercial viability, marijuana really took that dual pathway where commercialization came in both the medical form as well as the eventual promise of recreational legalization. And this led to really broad commercialization and really wide market penetration across the country. Psychedelics, they're likely to be more integrated directly with the healthcare system, akin to pharmaceutical models or in-person care models focused on therapeutic efficacy rather than kind of wide-ranging market penetration. So I think there are some parallels in stigma and policy evolution, but there's big differences in the policy intricacies and their ultimate commercialization paths.
Thanks, Matt. And now we'll move to Q&A. Thank you to our audience. I do see your questions coming in. Please continue to submit them, and we'll get through as many as we can in the next half hour or so. Fred, I'm going to send this first question to you, but Sandeep, you may want to jump in as well. What, if anything, do we know from a research perspective about stacking different psychedelics and the potential for a combined effect?
It's an incredibly interesting question because, to the best of our knowledge, this type of polypharmacology, if you will, is occurring out in the real world. Very little is known about it empirically, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that we've been very careful to slowly and systematically work through the clinical trials that have occurred so far and that are being conducted with psilocybin. There are the weight of the evidence right now for any clinical benefit in the modern era is mostly behind psilocybin, and there's less information about LSD. There's a lot of information now about the related compound MDMA. And a common kind of co-administration out in the real world for non-controlled use, not outside of a legal context, seems to be the co-administration of MDMA and psilocybin, or MDMA and LSD. These are studies that yet have to really be conducted. There was a recent study conducted by a group in Europe that demonstrated that it is, under the right conditions, safe. They showed some safety for co-administering MDMA and LSD, but no benefit of MDMA with a co-administration of LSD. There are some studies planned in this area, but no more yet that have been published, and a lot more work needs to be done.
Thanks, Fred. Sandeep, anything you want to add on this one?
It's a very rich field, and this is a low-hanging fruit question, especially when so many people are doing this in completely non-monitored recreational context. But it's something that we would like to study, and perhaps one day will in the near future.
So, Sandeep, a question for you. How are you able to do research in this area when we're talking about psychedelics that aren't actually approved? How does that work from a research perspective?
So these are illegal drugs, right? But they are regulated. So if you have a legitimate scientific reason to investigate it, you get approvals from various governmental bodies like the FDA, DEA, your local ethics board, then you actually can study illegal drugs legally. It's a highly regulated process that can take a very long time, and there are lots of safeguards in place. So it's not like anyone can just access this and do it. But there is a legal mechanism, regulated mechanism by which people can study these drugs.
Thanks, Sandeep. And Fred, a related question for you. Are there particular studies or types of studies that you'd like to do, but you can't because of regulatory hurdles?
Actually, in fact, quite a few. And many of those studies are studies of compounds that have been used recreationally or explored outside of controlled context that yet don't have enough data behind them to warrant or to support a human clinical trial. That's the kind of problem that can be solved with a substantial amount of investment in conducting those toxicology and safety trials, which arguably should be done. And so I'm not arguing that regulation is necessarily a bad one. It's just that it is a regulatory hurdle to studying a number of drugs that actually out in the real world seem to be comparable to the psychedelics that we are studying in the lab.
Thank you. Matt, question for you. How do you imagine that insurance companies may respond to integration of psychedelic therapies into mainstream healthcare?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lainie. I imagine, well, first, the response of insurance companies are going to be really important when it comes to eventual take-up throughout the country. There will probably be some initial hesitancy due to the novelty of these treatments and the recency of some of the evidence. However, the evidence continues to mount thanks to the great work of Fred and others at the center. So I imagine that there will be a gradual shift in the insurance company's mindset here. It might also change how mental health coverage is structured. Currently, mental health coverage is structured as a longer-term treatment, but we know from the research on psychedelics that sometimes a shorter course of treatment than the standard of care for mental health care might be more efficacious and cost savings. So it's possible insurance companies could end up steering people towards the less expensive treatment.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. Sandeep, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you study use of psychedelics to treat addictions. We have a question about addiction to psychedelics themselves. One is that possible? And is that something that you experience in your own, that you see in your own practice?
Great question. So addiction, which applies to lots of different drugs, typically means something like people taking escalating amounts of a drug in the face of mounting consequences, social, financial, legal, whatever. And then it just starts to control their life. Maybe they're doing it every day. Maybe they need to take way more of the drug to have the same effect. And you can find that pattern with alcohol, with opioids, with benzodiazepines, with all manner of drugs. But there is something that is obscured when we just call a drug, right? Not all drugs behave the same way. So psychedelics, you really do not see very commonly at all this kind of pattern. There is tolerance. There's very rapid tolerance. But that doesn't lead to people taking repeated doses over and over again, chasing greater and greater highs, ruining their life by, it actually tends to be, again, I want to be very clear, there are pretty substantial risks to the use of these drugs, but it does not, classic addiction does not seem to be one of them. Yeah, I can end there, I guess.
And Sandeep, thanks. Can you say a bit more about what the risks are? You said classic addiction isn't one of them, but what are some of the risks?
Yeah, and I should be clear. I mean, when I'm talking about psychedelics, lots of people mean lots of different things when they talk about psychedelics. I'm talking about drugs like psilocybin, like LSD. But one of them is simply behavioral, right? I mean, you take a big dose of psilocybin, you walk out into traffic because you're disoriented, you don't know where you are. That's obviously dangerous. And even in controlled settings like our clinical trials, you often see people in quite a lot of psychological distress. And it does require some know-how to how to manage that safely. But also there are people who probably should not take psychedelics at all. And this includes, and again, we don't fully know the risk, we don't know the magnitude, but we think there is one. People who have psychotic disorders or people who have some propensity towards bipolar disorder. Again, we don't fully know the exact risk, and this is why research is needed. But I mean, I have seen clinically where people have gotten psychotic, have gotten manic. And so, again, these are risks that are known, and they can be managed with appropriate patient selection in a monitored environment. But that doesn't mean that they translate to just anybody doing it and they want.
And thank you. Fred, several questions coming in for you about, can you talk us through what does it really mean when you say things like administered in a controlled environment? Can you actually walk us through what that looks like?
Thank you, Lainie. That's a great question, and it's sometimes a little opaque what we mean when we say psychedelic-assisted therapy or psychedelic therapy or controlled environment. To give some kind of boundaries to that, what occurs when a participant is enrolled within one of our clinical trials is that they first will undergo a series of meetings, often 6 to 8 hours, in trials where we're investigating the efficacy of psilocybin for some type of psychiatric illness. During these 6 to 8 hours of meetings, participants will be introduced to the types of experiences that they may encounter during a psychedelic experience. One of the things that we acknowledge with people is that we don't have any way of predicting exactly what a person will experience, but here's the range from the very good to the very bad. We also then kind of try to give people some tools and thoughts about how to kind of cope with and handle challenging psychological experiences when they occur. But through this process, we're possibly providing some unstructured psychotherapy, and we're building trust and rapport with the participants such that they feel safe and that they trust the study team while going into this experience. And then after that 6 to 8 hours of preparation, we ask participants to show up early in the morning, where we undergo some final screenings and then administer an experimental compound, often psilocybin. And then during the next 6 to 8 hours, 2 study team members who have built rapport with the individual, including at least one trained therapist, we will sit with the participant and accompany them while they're experiencing all of the varied drug effects that they might encounter. We conduct these sessions in what a controlled setting is essentially a warmly appointed room within our research center, where participants lay on a couch and don eye shades and headphones, and we tuck them in under a blanket and we tell them to turn their attention inward to whatever arises in consciousness. Then the 2 study team members will kind of monitor the participant throughout the day. We check on blood pressure and heart rate occasionally throughout the day, and we check in with the participant to make sure we understand how they're feeling. If they're distressed, we will provide reassurance, and at the end of the day, we debrief with them. We send them home in the care of a loved one or a close friend. And then in the following days and weeks, and sometimes months, we will repeatedly meet with the participant to provide aftercare and discuss the experience that they had, try to make sense of it, and help them to reintegrate that into their lives. So that's what we mean when we say psychedelic therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy. And obviously, as Dr. Nayak indicated, there's a lot more than just a compound, being ingested, and it is this interaction of the kind of therapeutic experience with the compound that we believe creates change. And the controlled setting there quite practically is the room in which it happens, the room in which it occurs, with careful monitoring by trained specialists.
Thanks, Fred. And one follow-up to that, is it typically a one-time experience, or can it be a series of experiences?
Yes. Sorry about that. It has been, some studies have been conducted with only a single administration of psilocybin, and other studies have involved, most other studies that have not been a single administration have been 2 or 3 administrations. There's kind of a micro and a macro question embedded here. In terms of like one intervention, that might look like a single or 2 or maybe even 3 doses of psilocybin over a relatively short period of time, weeks to a month. And once that's over, that to date is usually the intervention for a clinical trial. But open questions include, but are not limited to, whether that's optimal, whether different answers are optimal for different indications, and what in a long term, the macro sense. Well, if a person is treated today and they recover from depression, will they need to come back for therapy in a year or 5 years or 10? And the field has not caught up to that question because we have not been studying these issues for long enough. But that is an obvious next question to ask.
Thank you. Matt, question for you. What do you see as the possible economic impacts of incorporating psychedelics into mainstream healthcare for mental health disorders or for substance use disorders?
Yeah, so I'm an economist by training, so I think a lot about these things and think about projecting out when there's a lot of uncertainty. But it has the potential to be transformative in an economic impact, right? Let's take mental health just to start. 1 in 5 adults in the United States have a mental illness. 1 in 25 have a serious mental illness. And there's just an enormous treatment gap. About 50% of folks with mental illness in this country receive any treatment in a given year. It's possible that the current standard of care for treatment involving long-term use of medications as well as cognitive therapy, these are quite costly, and the standard is to stay on them for a very long time. As we've talked about, psychedelics like psilocybin, the efficacy in the clinical trials is much shorter treatment cycles. So when we're talking about economic impact, if that holds in the long term, it has the potential to save the healthcare system millions or billions of dollars through reduced medication costs, decreased need for inpatient care, and importantly, when it comes to mental illness, less reliance on long-term disability benefits, which is a huge economic cost when it comes to mental health and substance use disorders.
Thanks, Matt. Fred, question for you. So you just talked us through what the controlled environment looked like. Follow-up question about those who are trained to administer within this environment. Can you explain what that training involves and how someone becomes qualified to do this work?
That's another excellent question, and the real answer is that it's not completely settled yet. Frankly, the best predictors, some of the best predictors of treatment outcomes really point in the direction of therapeutic alliance. We believe that the best qualified people at the moment, at least I believe, to provide this therapy are those who are professionally trained and licensed and have a kind of an ethical backing and a moral backing to understand the delivery of care in an environment and within individuals who may be very vulnerable especially during the acute effects of high doses of psychedelic drugs. That being said, there are individuals across the country and around the world with a variety of different backgrounds and training, some psychiatrists, some psychotherapists, many psychotherapists from a variety of different traditions and training sets of psychotherapy. There are some who are advocating for the allowance of pastoral care individuals to provide this. There are some open questions as to what the minimum requirement should be and what the most appropriate training should be. Many, and there are a number of programs popping up around the country and around the world to try to fill that gap. But it is as of yet not standardized. But I'd actually be very interested in Sandeep's thoughts about this as well. If I can
Please, Sandeep. Thanks, Fred.
I mean, the the number one thing is so I guess this treatment, we talk about it, all the ways in which it's different from regular conventional clinical care, psychiatric care, psychotherapeutic care. But I'm actually, and all those things are true. I mean, this is like an impressive treatment. It works very differently. But I've also been equally impressed by how similar it is and how familiar it is and how it can actually be resolved or boiled down into the kinds of psychotherapeutic processes that would happen normally in psychotherapy, or on the more extreme end for the acute drug effects. Like, it's not so different from dealing with the kinds of things that you might see in psychiatry. So like, just a good foundation and solid clinical training is, I think, the first step. There are so many things that have arisen in these trials dealing with patients that I would not have known how to do had I not been trained as a clinician beforehand. And then there are lots of specific things. And so when we're training new facilitators, it's like we give them like kind of one-on-one, like we spend like lots of time discussing with them like what the modality is, how to do it, how it differs from regular therapy, how it overlaps. But then we don't just throw them in. It's an apprentice model. So we would typically have them sort of almost, it's two facilitators at a time. So you pair them with somebody who's very experienced and have them do that a number of times until they can demonstrate that they're comfortable and competent with the method.
Thanks, Sandeep. Matt, question for you. Can you explain the difference between decriminalization and legalization? And if you think it's relevant, talk us through what we've seen with cannabis and how that might be relevant here in these areas.
Yeah, so it can mean a variety of different things. There's a lot of heterogeneity in these policies. I think some folks see decriminalization as a first step, but it can be a lot more complicated than that. Let's take Oregon, for example, which decriminalized the use of all drugs, not just psychedelics, where if you could still get a ticket for drug possession, but that ticket said, directed you towards drug treatment rather than the threat of jail time. After decriminalization, there's now quasi-legalization in the state of Oregon. These drugs remain illegal under federal law. So under state law, they can be administered therapeutically by licensed professionals in licensed centers. They're still figuring out the details of that. And I'll also say that when it comes to some of these policies, there can be a backlash. There's quite a large backlash in Oregon right now to their decriminalization policy, not necessarily with regards to psychedelics, but some of the other drugs that were also decriminalized. That could spill over into psychedelic policy if these drugs are treated the same. That's different than some place like New Jersey, which didn't fully decriminalize, but really lowered the penalties and made it a much lower level offense. But just for psilocybin, not for all drugs. So there's really a lot of variation across states right now, which makes it a important thing for us to study.
Thanks, Matt. Fred, what legislative changes do you think need to be made to further research in psychedelics or even other controlled substances?
Thank you, Lainie. I want to state clearly that I think there are a lot of good aspects and features of our current regulatory landscape that ultimately may not be perfect. They may make the process a bit long and drawn out, and they're very restrictive, but these all work in the direction of safety rather than the direction of harm. And I think we need to acknowledge that and also be careful not to dismantle any kind of regulatory structures that would lead to increased harm. And that's really the bottom line. With that said, there are a number of pieces of legislation that have been proposed that may be worthwhile considering. One is a piece of bipartisan and bicameral legislation that has recently been proposed. And please forgive me, the act is blanking on me, and I'm going to name it in a minute when I go find it. But essentially, this is proposing that drugs that are Schedule 1 that are provided with breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA be automatically rescheduled to Schedule 2. And the rationale behind that is that, by definition, Schedule 1 drugs are incredibly toxic, highly addictive, and have no known medical use. Breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA is an acknowledgement of an up-and-coming drug that shows a really a high degree of early effect sizes and great potential. And if I understand correctly, the breakthrough therapy designation serves to fast track kind of studying and potential regulatory approval of those drugs. That by definition suggests that a compound has some medical value, and it's almost definitional that should obviate Schedule 1. The impact of that, I don't believe, would lead to greater harm in the sense of greater accessibility of these compounds, or substantially reduced criminal penalties, even though the question of whether criminalization is appropriate is another question altogether. But moving from Schedule 1 from Schedule 2 should have minimal impact on accessibility of these drugs outside of a controlled setting, but should greatly increase the feasibility of conducting research on these clinical trials and on these compounds. And the barriers to access for Schedule 1 drugs for researchers are not insignificant at all. The net outcome of this, I believe, will really be overall increased safety across the board. I was actually asked this question yesterday in a congressional hearing for the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, who held a briefing on hearing rather on emerging therapies, specifically new therapies for treatment of suicidality, and psychedelics were the topic. And the question was posed. I think that there are some great examples of Schedule 2 drugs that are far more toxic and addictive than psilocybin, one of which is ketamine. Ketamine is not a Schedule 1 drug, but it is a drug that we know a ton about. We know so much more about ketamine now than we do than psilocybin. And one of the reasons, I believe, is because it is so much easier to conduct research with drugs outside of Schedule 1. If we have to wait until a final approval with the FDA to find a rescheduling of a drug out of Schedule 1 or the formulation, then we're setting ourselves that much further back in time before we can begin to answer all of the plethora of questions that are still left on the table regarding, optimal ways of delivering the therapy, additional indications for which they may be useful, and other safety parameters. So essentially, easing the regulations for researchers to really ultimately bolster the safety record and our overall knowledge, I think would make a huge difference.
Thanks, Fred. Sandeep, question for you. Can you explain how dosing works with psychedelics in your own research?
Yeah. So people sometimes think that because we're official research, academic, whatever, we're giving like doses that are not, maybe they're a lot lower than what people are doing out in the wild. We're talking about high doses of psychedelics, and in many instances these are even sometimes higher than kinds of doses that people might use recreationally, but they're broadly speaking comparable. There is this phenomenon called microdosing, where people take very, very low doses, and I'm not talking about research necessarily, but things that people do out in the wild, where they maybe don't even experience much effects at all. We're not really talking about that. We're talking about doses where people would be, maybe they might forget where they are, or they would have a lot of difficulty navigating the world on their own. Like they're impaired from the standpoint of like any kind of day-to-day functioning. So we're talking about high doses, though, basically.
And
Lainie, I'm sorry, if I could just
please
follow up on my previous, it's the Breakthrough Therapies Act introduced by Representatives Mason Dean, as well as Senators Paul and Booker. That's the act that I was referring before. Sorry.
And actually, if I could just add on to your comments, Fred, I mean, I completely agree. And I think, we're researching Schedule 1 drugs, but methamphetamine, fentanyl, these are not Schedule 1, these are Schedule 2. And so removing some of the legal barriers simply to do the research would be great, but also there needs to be more money. We're still piecing together funds from philanthropy and this and that. We do not have normal government grant research operating at the scale that is required to actually see any of this through.
Thanks, Sandeep.
Lainie, one thing I'd add to that, these great points, is the other piece of this act, in addition to easing opportunities for regulations around research, is also allowing for the potential of compassionate use, which is allowed for Schedule 2 drugs. So there are some folks out there who might really benefit from this treatment now. And by moving to Schedule 2, this would create the option for some folks in very special circumstances to get access to this treatment outside of a clinical trial. So it's another great benefit, or another potential benefit, I'd say, of moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2.
Thanks, Matt. Fred, I'm going to try to take a couple of questions and wrap them into one for you, which is, can you give us there's been a lot of fascination over decades about psychedelics. How have you seen that change, especially in the last couple of years, relative to your research, to your center, and the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I have a couple anecdotes for you that may be interesting. One is that I began this research in 2013, about 10 years ago, and I told my mom, who had grown up in the 60s, what I was doing, and she said, "Oh my God, that's it's wild. Doesn't that stuff make you jump out of windows?" And I said, No, it's not like that. But I have to admit, we don't have windows in our session rooms right now. But that's not the point. The point is that these are compounds that had been used in the past, but we're investigating them for medical use and under controlled settings. And there's that controlled settings again, right? I think that there is still the kind of patina of kind of stigma of psychedelics that is hanging on for some people. But as a counterpoint to that, one of the most surprising things to me as a scientist, once I began to get into this research, was the degree to which my colleagues, both supporters and detractors, have come to the table with, forgive me, sober and objective questions. That's an interesting effect size. What are the confounds? Can you replicate that? Does this generalize to other populations, et cetera, to understand the mechanisms? And I think that there's something really unique going on in that some of the propaganda that has been kind of pushed on psychedelics decades ago is beginning to fall away, and we have the opportunity to have a much more evidence-based discussion about psychedelics, especially as we grow the evidence base. That said, it is a little concerning that promise and potential is sometimes translated into hype and overpromise, and I worry that this is kind of a double-edged sword. There are absolutely, truly people throughout the world who are deeply suffering, and some of these individuals apply to be within our studies, and they say, if I could just get into this study, I know, this will be it. This will finally work, and I have to be very diligent as much as I can to educate people about therapeutic misconception, which is the misconception that if we're studying it, it must work, which is almost never the case in toto. We're almost always studying it because we don't know if it works or how it works or in whom or under what circumstances or for how long. And so we have to be very clear to educate people coming into our clinical trials. But I think that education also needs to really reach the greater public in a much more clear fashion, along with the communication that these drugs do still absolutely hold risks. They are powerful compounds that hold great potential and are not without risk. So there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of hope, but we're trying carefully to make sure that hope doesn't tip over into unreasonable hyper expectation.
Understood. Thanks. As we come up to the end of this briefing, I'm going to give each of you a chance to spend a minute or so telling us your final thoughts, anything that we didn't get to in the Q&A. Sandeep, I'm going to start with you. Matt, then you, and Fred, you'll get the last word. So Sandeep, please.
There's so much I could say. I mean, this is just such an exciting space, and every couple of months there's something completely new, and it's coming from all these different angles. It's not just the research, it's also society, it's also these different statewide initiatives. I can't even keep up with my own little narrow section anymore of psychedelic clinical trials. And so I guess I would just kind of encourage everyone to keep an open mind, whether you're anti-psychedelic, pro-psychedelic, whatever. We are going to have pretty good evidence in the relatively near future about who these are good for, how to use them, and we shouldn't be too excited or too pessimistic. We actually have a mechanism to just learn about these.
Thanks, Sandeep. Matt, final thoughts.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me for this great conversation. One final thought would be, I think we focus a lot, rightly so, on federal policy making, given its importance. But I think it's also important for federal policymakers to look to see what's going on in the states, because there is so much variation in how states are currently treating psychedelics, and that allows for some natural experiments in seeing how these might work. So I think, you know, the quote laboratories of democracy definition of the states can be a little trite, but in this case might be accurate. And I'd encourage federal policymakers to look at these impacts in the states.
Thanks, Matt. And Fred, you get the last word.
Thank you, Lainie. I wanted to make just a couple short points. One, not all psychedelics are the same. People call MDMA psychedelic. They call psilocybin psychedelic. Those two drugs are different in important ways. And it's important to just understand that you shouldn't necessarily conflate them. And of course, we don't have time to go into all the differences, but just, you know, leave with that note. The second is that these drugs do carry risk, and we should not be surprised if people encounter those risks, especially in uncontrolled settings. We need to be able to separate that in our minds from the true incredible potential benefit that these compounds and their approaches could have in medical settings. And the final is that we should not expect these compounds to be panacea. One of the things that people are very excited about is the potential that, as Sandeep mentioned, and as I mentioned, as others have mentioned, you know, these drugs may really, truly have efficacy in mood disorders, substance use disorders, anxiety-related disorders, other psychiatric disorders, and possibly even neurological disorders. We shouldn't expect them to work for everything, and that's okay. But, you know, we should, you know, as Sandeep said, keep an open mind to the possibilities and just, you know, tread carefully to make sure that we're thoughtfully working through these issues.
Thanks, Fred. And with that, I'll wrap up. I'd like to thank Fred Barrett, Sandeep Nayak, and Matt Eisenberg for joining me today. I'd also like to give a big thank you to everyone who attended this briefing, and especially to those in our audience who submitted questions for our experts. A recording of this event will be made available on this website. Today's panelists, along with faculty from across Johns Hopkins, will continue to work on the issues that impact our world. Thank you again for joining us.